All right, we're going to continue with our study on prophecy, and just to review just briefly, last week we were talking about the restoration of the nation of Israel, what the Scripture calls the budding of the fig tree, and these are part of the signs of the end that are related to the nation of Israel. And so we know that Israel and the Jewish people are God's chosen people, God's chosen nation. And today, we are living in the dispensation of grace. Jesus turned away from the Jews for a time. The dispensation of grace is that time period where God opened up the door of salvation to us Gentiles. But there's coming a day when that time will end. And God, the Bible tells us that the next dispensation, when it comes, He's going to turn back to the Jews. And there's all kind of things that happen in those 7 years, what we call the tribulation and the great tribulation, that are terrible things that are going to happen in the world. And at the end of that, Israel is going to recognize that Jesus is their Messiah. And they are going to embrace Him and accept Him as their Messiah. That is something that's going to be coming in the future. And that will lead into the last dispensation, that is the kingdom age. Right after the Battle of Armageddon, Jesus will establish His kingdom here on this earth. And we will enter into what we call the millennium.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So line this up for me. So there's going to be talk about the USA now. There's going to be an issue over here, which we think it's going to be civil war. Everything's going to go. We're going to be. I don't know what we're going to be.
Don't confuse the news with the Bible.
Well, that's what. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, because the Bible don't say anything about the United States.
I know, but
doesn't really say anything.
Well, I don't. Well, never mind.
So,
I was going to ask about Antichrist, but that's fine.
Okay, we'll go to that. Go to the Antichrist.
No.
Yeah.
Nobody over there then knew this was even here.
No.
Really, I mean,
They didn't even know this continent was here.
Well,
Yeah.
knew it was fixing to be here.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you're not going to ask your question,
no.
we'll move on. Okay. So, I said all that, review, talked about the dispensations to bring us to back to our lesson where we left off last week. We left off talking about the city of Jerusalem. Now, Israel is the focal point of the plan of God. It all revolves around Israel. They are the chosen people of God. They are the chosen nation. And although God has turned away from them for a time, He is going to turn back to them. Israel, if you want to understand end-time prophecy, if you want to understand biblical prophecy, you have to look at Israel, because that is the point. Mm-hmm. That is the focal point. But even more central to these things, even more so than the nation of Israel, is the city of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. It focuses even closer. It narrows even more to the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, more than any other city on the whole planet, will play the most prominent role in end-time events. All we'd have to do is look to Israel and look to Jerusalem to see what is going on. The holy city itself is yet another indicator, it's another sign of the return of Jesus Christ. It all centers there around Jerusalem. Now I want us to go back to Luke 21 and 24. We looked at this, I believe, last week. And let's just read this, because we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Speaking of the Jews, speaking of the citizens of Jerusalem. And it says, "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and they shall be led away captive into all nations. We know that part has already come to pass. And then it says, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. And we know that has come to pass. Ever since the prophecies of Daniel, the vision, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of the image, the big statue that was made of different types of material, head of gold, shoulders of silver, waist and stomach and all of brass, and legs of iron, feet of clay and iron mixed together, representing those 5 coming kingdoms. From that point forward began the time of the Gentiles. Began the time period that Jerusalem would be trodden down of the Gentiles. From that point on, they had no king of their own. They had foreign rulers who ruled over them. So Jerusalem ever since has been trodden down of the Gentiles. But it says that it would be this way until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And so we are looking. That's one of the things that we're looking for. That is a huge part of prophecy, is when the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So we'll come back to that. But speaking of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is really going to be more than just where these last events take place. When we get through those 7 years of tribulation and we get to these prophecies being fulfilled, Jerusalem still has a part. There's still more that's going to take place with Jerusalem, because it's more than just where the third temple is going to be built. And I believe that's soon. Everything is ready. They're just waiting for the right time. But Jerusalem is more than that. Jerusalem is more than where the Antichrist is going to come in and declare himself to be God. Jerusalem, although it's been trodden down for centuries, Jerusalem is going to be the headquarters where Jesus is going to reign in his millennial kingdom.
Now, he's going to be here for 1,000 years.
It's going to be for 1,000 years.
Are you going to get to what happens after that and after that?
I think so. I think we will. I think we will.
Talking about that.
Yeah, I got a lot of study to do there.
I asked her, I said, what happens after the 1,000?
Wait a minute. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
We just wanted to make it to that. We didn't take part of it on that, did we?
Yeah, I've got a lot of study to do there to get ready for that. But Jerusalem is going to continue on. Jerusalem is going to be there in that 1,000 years. Jerusalem, there's going to be a new millennial temple that will be in Jerusalem those 1,000 years. The Bible speaks, we'll look at this later, but the Bible speaks of the Feast of Tabernacles will be observed. Passover, I think, will be observed again. There's different things that are going to take place, but there's not going to be any furnishings in that temple, because all of the old furnishings pointed to Jesus, and now Jesus himself will be in that temple. So it's going to be different. So we're going to come to that at some point. It's very interesting stuff.
With signs everywhere going, he has arrived.
He has arrived.
Yeah.
That's right. That's mind-blowing to think
I know
about.
it is, yeah.
Yeah. But we're going to come back to that.
Oh, goody.
But Jerusalem is more than what we even think of today. There's still a lot more that Jerusalem has to play in the plan of God. Now, the recovery of old Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, in 1967 was one of the greatest fulfillment of prophecy in our day, in our time. In 48, when we had the Arab-Israeli War, as soon as they declared themselves to be a sovereign nation again, then there were these 5 Arab nations that attacked Israel. They wanted to stamp it out and destroy it before it ever even got anywhere. But they were victorious. They won that war. But the United Nations came in and imposed a truce while Jerusalem was still in Arab hands, while the old city was still controlled by the Arabs. And so in the peacemaking process, in the ceasefire and all these things, all the politics, the Arabs ended up maintaining control of the Temple Mount. And they promised that they would allow the Jews to have access to the Temple Mount, but they never kept their word. They never kept their word. But that's not surprising to me. Now, this is not to make any type of racist statement. I know it could be misunderstood that way. To say, I'm not surprised that the Arabs didn't keep their word. It's not a racial issue. It's not really even a cultural issue. It's an ideology. It's a difference in ideology. It's the religion of the Arabs. Because while Christianity teaches us that it's never okay to lie to anybody, to your family, to your friends, to your enemies. We're always to tell the truth. But Islam teaches them that it's okay to lie to infidels.
Oh.
So, I'm not surprised that they didn't keep their word, because their religion teaches them that you don't have to be righteous to non-Muslims. You don't have to treat them well. It's okay to mistreat and to lie to non-Muslims. So it really makes sense.
They're doing God's will, or they're Allah's will.
Yes.
Yeah.
They believe they have permission from Allah to lie to us,
Right.
because we're not Muslims. So it really makes sense that they did not keep their word, because it was an agreement they made with the Jews. And they feel it's okay to lie to the Jews because they're not Muslim. Now I threw this in here. That was in 1948. And then here's a current photo of the Temple Mount. This is a gate that goes up onto the Temple Mount, and you see the Dome of the Rock there in the background. But here in the foreground, you see some Jewish people. You see the skull caps and all, but they are not permitted to go any further. They are barred from going up onto their Temple Mount.
Somebody's standing up there on the steps.
That may be a Muslim. I'm not sure.
Must be.
But there's been lots of conflict and issues over the Temple Mount over the decades since then. But I have a picture here that I found. It's a photo, an aerial photo of the Temple Mount. They've outlined it with a rectangle there so you can see. And here you see the Al-Aqsa Mosque as an actual mosque where the Muslims come and worship. The gold dome there on the Dome of the Rock, that is not a mosque. It's actually a shrine, and it's built on top of the spot where the Holy of Holies, the foundation stones of the Holy of Holies, was right there on that spot. But they built a shrine there because the Muslims believed that Muhammad ascended up to Allah from that very spot, because they are also sons of Abraham. And this is also the spot where Abraham was to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. So this spot is important to Christians because Jesus was in and out of the temple here. He did miracles. He taught. He was frequently on this Temple Mount. So it's important to Christians. It's important to the Jews for obvious reasons, but it's also important to the Muslims because of the connection to Abraham. This is a very, very important spot. One of the most important places on the earth, if not the most important place on the earth. And one day, there will be a millennial temple where Jesus will reside in that temple on that spot. It's incredible to think about.
Yeah, it is.
And then we move on to June 1967, the Six-Day War. This war broke out, and from the high places of the old city, the Arabs began shelling. Artillery shells began exploding there. No part of the city was spared. For 2 days, they fired rockets and artillery mortars, whatever they were shooting at homes, public buildings, hotels. Nothing was spared. Everything was a target. But meanwhile, the Egyptian forces, because there were multiple nations Arab nations that came against Israel in this war. The Egyptian forces over in the Sinai Desert were having some problems. And during this war, I chose this picture with the jets because the Israeli Air Force absolutely dominated. They dominated. They had the Israelis for several years prior had done reconnaissance missions. They photographed every airfield. They knew where everything that these Arab countries had, they knew exactly where they were. And so when this war kicked off, they used that information and they bombed everything, absolutely destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, if you want to call it an Air Force. And so they completely routed the Egyptian military. It left the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, free after they took care of the Egyptian Air Force. Then they were free at that point to fire on all those guns that were shooting shells onto Jerusalem. And the Arab Legion, that group of Arab nations that were coming against Israel, were basically defenseless. It was an absolute bloodbath, and lasted 6 days. Within 2 days, Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, Bethlehem, all the West Bank were then in Israeli control.
Is this when they took over the Golan Heights too?
I think so.
Because
I think so.
Such a strategic area.
If the Palestinians, the Arabs in this area, had left it alone and left things the way that it was divided up in 48, they would have been much better off, because after this war, Israel basically quadrupled what they possessed. They took back a lot of the things that were previously divided in 1948. Despite Jewish municipal controls in Jerusalem, because the Jews do control the city of Jerusalem. However, if you just go down the streets of Jerusalem, you come across Arab shops like this one, merchants, shoppers, peddlers, local citizens. They're Arabs, many different Gentile people who live in Jerusalem, a lot of them who come from Arab descent. Today, here's a picture of an Arab praying there in Jerusalem. Today, this is a fairly current picture of all of the Arab politicians who sit on the Knesset, which is Israel's governing body. There are multiple Arab people who sit on that governing body. So it's safe to say that today Jerusalem still remains trodden down of the Gentiles. Lets us know that the time of the Gentiles has not yet been fulfilled. Now, from 48 through 67 and then to today, we are glad that the Jews have returned to their homeland. They have a place, they have a homeland that has a deep connection spiritually, culturally, historically. But it's been very bittersweet. All of these years, it's been very bittersweet. Their neighbors, all these Arab nations around them, none of them have ever been happy for the Jews to come home. They were restored to their homeland, but many of these people had to move out. They have been occupying this place, and so there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of hatred toward the Jews, even today. And so let's move on to the next section of our lesson, which is the conflict of the nations. Conflict of the nations. Jesus predicted this. He predicted that the Jewish people, first of all, would recapture Jerusalem. that the fig tree would bud. But he also, after that, added that the hatred for the Jews would increase. And we have seen that. Anti-Semitism has been building and building and building. Most recently, the issues with Gaza, it's been disturbing to me how many of our college students today are pro-Gaza. And it just highlights their utter ignorance of the situation. They listen to news sources that are anti-Israel. They believe all those things. Their liberal professors in these colleges are teaching them that Israel is the aggressor, Israel is the evil one. And it's just adding to this feeling of anti-Semitism. And Jesus told us that the Gentiles would exalt themselves over the Jews. The Jews would be trodden down, Jerusalem would be trodden down. And all these people are going to seek the destruction of Israel. And that's what we're hearing today. There's so many people in the world today that just openly call for the destruction of Israel. They openly talk about wiping out the entire Jewish race. And, we look at the things happening in Gaza. Israel doesn't really have a choice but to respond and to defend themselves. Israel's had this long-standing policy, like the U.S., of not negotiating with terrorists. They do not negotiate, period. Ever. No matter what it costs them, they will not negotiate with them. Basically, when things like this happen, if you kill one of the Jews, they're going to kill 1,000 of you. They're going to respond hard. Way above any kind of... It's not going to be a proportionate response. It's going to be a very loud, very swift, very, very hard response. And they have to do that. But it's because there's so much hatred for the nation of Israel. The prophet Zechariah... Oh, I skipped this. Okay, let me go back. Adolf Hitler, in World War II, he decided that he would exterminate the Jewish race. We know that he promoted the Aryan race, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, ideal human. That's what he believed in. And I always noted that he is not blonde or blue-eyed.
Yeah.
But he did feel that they were superior to the Jews. They viewed the Jews as subhuman. It's just terrible things that you would hear them say. And although he killed millions of Jews, but he was unsuccessful in the long run because he did not wipe them out. Terrible, terrible thing that he did. And even though his final solution failed, was not completed, it did stir up a new revival of hatred for Jews. Around the world, people begin to increase their rhetoric and their hateful language toward the Jews, their treatment of the Jews. And Zechariah, he described Jerusalem as a cup of trembling and a burdensome stone for all people. It's God's promise. In the Old Testament, God promised that He would bless those who bless Israel, and He would curse those who curse Israel. And so for all of these people who come against Israel, who hate them and seek their destruction, Israel for them is going to end up being a cup of trembling and a burdensome stone for them, because God's promise will come to pass. God is going to punish those people for their treatment of the Jews. We go to Ezekiel chapter 38. The prophet Ezekiel had a number of prophecies concerning Israel, and God showed him at least 2,500 years ago. I can't remember how long it's been since Ezekiel lived on the earth, but a long, long time. And God showed him the Battle of Armageddon. He showed all those nations that are going to come one day against Israel. And God gave him this information, showed him these things so specific that it really resembles a modern geography textbook. It is so accurate. Those enemy nations that he spoke of 2,500 years ago can be positively identified today. We can look at the scripture and we can know which of those nations are going to attack Israel at that last battle. And so Ezekiel begins by revealing the leader, the ringleader of these nations. He starts looking at the family tree and the genealogy. He refers to this as Gog. Anybody ever heard of Gog and Magog? Ezekiel 38, verses 2 through 3. For some reason, I did not put a slide here for that, so I'll just read it. Ezekiel 38, beginning in verse 2. Beginning in verse 1. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. And say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And we're going to come back to some of this in just a minute. But who is Gog? That's an odd name. It's not an English name for sure. Never had a kid on my school bus named Gog. Melanie's had some doozies in her class over the years.
Not Gog.
But not Gog. Who is this strangely named character? The word Gog comes from the Hebrew phrase Nesi Rosh, which means leader. It means leader. Some Hebrew lexicons today, such as one of them is Brown Driver and Briggs Hebrew Lexicon, those people equate Rosh, the Hebrew word Rosh, as the proper name of a people, and then they designate it as today's Russia. However, there's a lot of scholars that don't agree with that. And in my book here, this is I've told you about this book. Brother Ken Raggio wrote the Daniel Prophecies. It is a monster of a book. And but I don't know of anybody in the world that has put more time and research and dedicated their lives to studying prophecy than Brother Raggio. And so I put a lot of stock in what he has to say. A lot of scholars don't agree with that designation of Rosh being the proper name of the people in today's Russia. When you look at a map of Russia, you see the largest country in the world by landmass. It spans from Europe all the way on the left side. It goes over the top of the Middle East, and it goes completely across Asia, and it's just a short distance on the right side from Alaska. It's absolutely gigantic. It includes Siberia, and absolutely massive. And so when we think about Russian people, the first thing that pops in our head are white, Caucasian, European people. We think of Moscow. We think of those northwestern areas of Russia, which borders Europe. And but there's so many more peoples and languages and cultures that are part of Russia. Siberia is part of Russia. Those people are more closely connected to the Mongols in Mongolia. That's the Asian side. You go down in the south, you're bordering all of these Asian and Middle Eastern countries. And you see that reflected in the people there in South Russia. These people over here by Europe, the Russians there, the stereotypical Russian that we think of. If you remember any old movies from the 80s that had Arnold Schwarzenegger where they played, during the Cold War period, they had the movies reflected that. And you saw Russians, that's the people that you saw. Those people their roots come from Slavic and Finnish ancestry. But that is not the case in southern Russia. You go to southern Russia, you go to Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, a little place called Azerbaijan. All of those countries, those people have Arabic ancestry. And in ancient times, that whole area of southern Russia, you see this is the very bottom of Russia, and then here, this designated, the dotted line there, that is the country of Georgia. You have Azerbaijan, you have Armenia, Turkey, so you can kind of see where we are geographically. In ancient times, this whole area was called Scythia. Scythia, Scythia. And so Scythia, or southern Russia, is Gog, the land of Magog. I'm going to make this a little more plain. So who is Magog? Anybody ever heard of Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian?
Yes.
I have a large volume in there from Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews. Very accurate. He was a very conscientious historian. He described and documented things exactly as he saw. And it's respected. It's very much a scholarly book that people trust and respect today. If you read in his accounts, he refers to Magog. And when he talks about Magog, he says that they are whom the Greeks call Scythia. Again, that's the southern area of Russia. So let's restate the verse we just read using these modern names instead of Gog and Magog. And it would sound like this. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against the region of southern Russia, which is the Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. But he goes on in that verse. He says, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog. And then he says, the chief prince, of Meshech and Tubal. So who is the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal? Well, first of all, that term chief prince, I believe, refers to the demon principality of that region. I don't believe he's talking about a human being. There's multiple places in the Scripture where it uses this kind of language, a prince, to speak of a demon, a high-ranking demon that controls a large region. For instance, Daniel chapter 10. Daniel fasted and prayed, and he asked the Lord to send help. Let me turn that Bluetooth off there. He asked God to send help. And it said, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. In those days I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine in my mouth. Neither did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. He fasted, did not eat or drink for 3 weeks, and he prayed. And then he had an angelic visitor. It was the Archangel Michael who appeared to Daniel. And in verse 12 he said, Then said he unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God. 3 weeks ago, Daniel, when you first started, he said, Thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. Why did it take him 3 weeks?
He was fighting the Prince of Turkey, wasn't it?
Prince of Persia.
Persia, yeah.
He said, "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief priests, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. Now I'm come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days." So, there was an angelic battle that took place, and the prince of Persia was that demon prince who controlled Persia. Paul said in Ephesians 6 and 12, we looked at this extensively months ago. Paul said, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." And so, when I read this scripture and it talks about the prince, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, I believe that he's talking about a demonic power, and not a human being. And so, we do believe, I fully believe that there are angelic hierarchies, demonic powers, principalities, rulers that rule and govern this earth. There are demons that control cities. They're higher up. There's demons that control counties. I heard Brother Billy Cole, a preacher that is gone now, but he dealt a lot with spirits. He went to Asia as a missionary. I believe he was an apostle to Asia. Billy Cole. And I need to send you some videos from YouTube. You can listen to some of his preaching. But in Asia, he dealt with a lot of spiritual opposition. Had demons come to him and try to intimidate him. But I heard him say that demons seem to follow the man-made political lines. In a country where they draw on a map, say, this is the boundaries of this city, this is the boundaries of the county, this is the boundaries of the state, that the demons follow those lines. And he's talked about, and I have felt this before. One example to me is Selma. When you drive to Selma, when you cross over into the city limits of Selma, sometimes you can literally feel it. There is a dark, oppressive something that kind of comes over you at times when you drive into Selma. And you drive out of Selma and it goes away. Because they seem to observe and to follow those man-made political lines. So, if you look at how this verse in Ezekiel 38 is written, he says, "Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog." So, taking this view, I would believe that Gog is the chief prince of the land of Magog and of Meshach and Tubal. Meaning he is the demon prince in that region that's one day going to wage war on Israel. And Magog would be his region. Now, some people might have a different take on that, but I just want to say that's my opinion, that's my belief. So who is Meshach and who is Tubal? Meshach and Tubal were actually the sons of Japheth. If you go to Genesis 10 and 2, you can read about the sons of Noah. One of his sons was Japheth, and his sons were Meshach and Tubal, two grandsons of Noah. Now, a lot of people say that Meshach referred to what is now the city of Moscow, and Tubal referred to the Russian city of Tobolsky, which is on the Tobol River, very, very close to Tubal. You replace the U with an O, the Tobol River. And I've heard many, many people teach that. They talk about the Hebrew and how that's where you get the word Moscow. However, Ken Raggio in this book, he says, and there are numerous historical sources that they say that both Meshech and Tubal were parts of Scythia, or that southern region of Russia. Meshech is associated with the Meskheti mountain range and the Meskheti tribes. That mountain range and the Meskheti tribes are found in the immediate area today that is called Tbilisi, which is the capital city of Georgia. That's where you find the Meskheti mountain range and you find the Meskheti tribes of people. When you add to that the fact that there are many Georgians, the country of Georgia, many people in that country today, they claim to be the descendants of Meshech. So, when you put all that together, to me it makes a strong case for this alternate view of who Meshech and Tubal is. So that would mean that Gog and Magog, Meshech and Tubal are not in Russia proper, the northwestern European side where Moscow and Tobolsky is, but rather it's in that southern part of Russia.
That's above Asia and the Middle East.
It's directly above, it's due north, straight north from Israel,
Right.
which is important. The area that Ezekiel identifies as Meshech and Tubal are now known as Georgia and Armenia. The armies that one day are going to come against Jerusalem are going to come from the direction of these nations on the south of Russia. Now, we sometimes forget a lot of the history of Russia, but in recent times, just a couple of decades, there's been a lot of aggressive activity from Russia. In 2008, Russia invaded the country of Georgia. They took possession of these two provinces. The one in pink is South Ossetia, and over there in the blue or the teal, that's green, isn't it? Looks blue from here. The green is Abkhazia, two different provinces of Georgia, and they took those. Russia controls those. South Ossetia declared its independence from Georgia and allied with Russia. So over and over, we look at Russia today and we can clearly see Russia has a desire to expand south. In 2014, if you remember, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula, which was on the south of Ukraine, and it borders Georgia. They took it and they annexed it to the country of Russia. More recently, as we've seen, Russia has again attacked Ukraine, and is still attacking them today. I assume that war is still going on. Russia has designs to absorb the country of Ukraine. In addition to that, for decades, Russia has been providing arms to these Muslim states that are even further south. For years. Why is it that almost all the Arabs in the world shoot AK-47s? It's because that's a Russian-made rifle. Special forces, your army guys that are over in the Middle East, they would talk about hearing gunfire in the night or whatever, and they could identify from the sound if it was a American or European rifle or if it was an AK-47, because the AK-47 has a distinctive sound. And it's almost always the AK-47 that the Arabs are shooting. They got it from Russia. Russia has been providing them with equipment and arms and tanks. The 6-Day War, the Israeli Air Force were shooting down Russian MiG planes that were given to Syria and to Egypt. This has been going on a long time. Russia is aggressively moving southward toward the Middle East. It's coming, this area we're talking about is coming down from Russia in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. In Ezekiel's words, Magog, or Russia, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, which is Georgia, is one day going to come down this same path and attack Israel. All the other states mentioned in the verses of Ezekiel today are Muslim nations. Iran, Syria, Turkey, Iraq. These are all predominantly fundamentalist Muslim nations. And the radical extremist sects of Islam are growing rapidly there. So, in the future, when these things take place, when we get to the Battle of Armageddon, this coming invasion of Israel is going to be by communists and by Muslims. Ezekiel pinpoints a warning in Ezekiel 38 and 15. And he says, And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses and a great company and a mighty army. Now, one thing to understand when you read these things in the Bible, and it gives a description of the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, it's always in the Scripture, it's always in relation to the position of Israel. So when it says you're coming out of the north parts, it means you're coming from north of Israel. It's always assuming Israel is the center point, which makes it very easy when you begin to look at prophecy to kind of figure out what it's talking about. You draw a line straight north from Israel, you come to this territory that we're looking at tonight. Israel also names other allies of Russia. In verses 5 and 6, he says, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, or all his troops, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all of his bands or troops, and many people with thee. So, looking at this list here, Bible scholars and historians all agree that ancient Persia is modern-day Iran. It was only until probably when I was a kid or just a little before I was born that Iran became known as Iran. Up until, I think, the 60s, it was always called Persia. That has never changed since ancient times. So it's very clear when the Bible mentions Persia, it's talking about Persia. It's talking about Iran today. It's an ancient country. It's interesting, you go all the way back to the book of Esther and you read about the plight of the Jews in the book of Esther, Haman and Mordecai and the king and all that whole story where Haman plotted to exterminate the Jews. This takes place in Persia. Persia, which is now Iran, is the first nation in history that wanted to exterminate the Jews. And here we are again today with Iran calling for them to be wiped off the map. That same demon prince is still working there today. That prince of Persia is still active. He's still working to get this same plan to come to pass. And Iran is very closely associated with Russia. They're tied to the United Arab Republic. So it would not be hard for Russia one of these days to convince Iran to join them to attack Israel. He goes on to say Ethiopia. The word Ethiopia comes from the Hebrew word Cush, which if you go back to Genesis 10 and 6 and look at the sons of Noah, you see that Cush is the grandson of Noah from his son Ham. We looked at Japheth, and now we look at Ham. His son is Cush. The descendants of Cush, the Bible tells us, you go back in Genesis and read it. It describes how Cush the grandson of Noah, his descendants, they migrated across the Red Sea to the area south of Egypt. So we can conclude today that all of the black people who originate in Africa, all the other black, whether it's African Americans today, we know they came from Africa. They're all a direct descendant of Cush, who moved. But think about it. After the flood, there were no people left in Africa. It was repopulated when Noah and his sons began to spread out over the earth. Cush came to Africa, and his descendants spread throughout that continent over the centuries. And so all of those countries today, those black tribes of different nations, they all descended from Cush. In the King James Version, if you've got a King James Bible, anywhere that you read Ethiopia, which is more than 20 times, if you go back and look up the Hebrew word, it's Cush. And so we see there's going to be numerous African nations that are going to join Russia when they invade Israel. They're going to come up and attack from the south. It's an African alliance that's going to join Russia, Gog and Magog, Meshech and Tubal. They're going to invade from the north. These African countries are going to invade from the south. Daniel prophesied in Daniel 11 and 40. He said, "At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships." So the king of the south, the king of the north, all of them working together to invade Israel from two directions. There is a huge spread of communism today in Africa. Communism is like a wildfire. It's going through those African countries. So we understand how easily they're going to join Russia and all of those nations from the north. Libya is mentioned. Let me go back to that verse. Libya is mentioned, but Libya today, the modern day Libya, is a lot smaller than the ancient Libya. The Libya that was mentioned in ancient times had a lot more territory. You go back to Genesis 10 and 6, looking at Ham's third son, whose name was Put, P-U-T. From that word, we get the word Libya. Put's descendants migrated west of Egypt to the northwest corner of Africa. That includes Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. All of those countries today make up ancient Libya. And then he goes on to talk about Gomer and his bands. Gomer was the region that today is western Turkey. The house of Togarmah was the region that is now eastern Turkey and parts of Armenia. So why would, and I'm going to finish with this real quick, why would Russia and her allies want to attack Israel? Russia's the largest country in the world, the largest by land mass. Why would they need a little tiny country about the size of New Jersey? Why would they single out this little tiny country of 3 to 4 million people? Ezekiel tells us that it's greed. He says in Ezekiel 38:13, "Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil?" He's speaking of Gog and Magog. Israel, as we've looked at recently, is destined, they are blessed of God to become a very wealthy nation. And in this one generation, we looked at how they've taken a barren, desolate place and now it flourishes. They've become one of the greatest exporters of fruits in the world. Agricultural, their percentage of increase every year is far beyond any other country. Israel, without a doubt, is the economic marvel of the world. In recent years, Israel has discovered and has begun developing one of the largest natural gas fields in the world, just off of the Israeli coast on the Mediterranean. It would be west of Israel. And it's worth trillions of dollars. Russia would love to take possession of those natural gas fields. And then when you look at all the resources in the Dead Sea, the minerals that are found in the Dead Sea are estimated to be worth more than $1 quadrillion,
My goodness.
according to Dr. Thomas Norton, who's the editor of Chemicals magazine. And another reason could be that Israel is so strategically positioned. It's the land bridge between Europe to the northeast. It's the land bridge to Asia to the west and to Africa to the southwest. It's one of the most strategic places on earth. But every prime minister that Israel has ever had has repeatedly expressed concern, sometimes fear of the Soviet Union. They have recognized from the beginning the great threat that Russia is to the nation of Israel. And according to Ezekiel, that Russian bear could attack at any time, at any moment. And we see today that threat increasing every week, every month. And so Israel's conflict with the nations is yet another sign that points to this is the generation, this is the last generation. We are living in the end of the end times.
Yes.
Amen. It's very clear. Very clear. Talked to my mom this afternoon before my bus kids came out, and she mentioned that to me. She said, Neil, I don't understand how there's so many people in our world today that can't see it.
I know.
They're those people that Jesus spoke about and said that in the end times that there will be those who say, where is the sign of His coming? Things continue as they have since our fathers. They are marrying and giving in marriage, eating and drinking as if nothing is ever going to change. But we see those signs. We see them. And I believe that we're living there. We're going to see these things come to pass. All right, we're going to stop there tonight. And thank you, everybody, thank you for being here.